In this lesson, we'll cover the two types of ways that you might be asked to evaluate an argument on critical reasoning questions of the verbal reasoning section, and potentially the data insights too. Now, first, you need to recognize the task, and you'll do so by probably seeing the word evaluate. And there are ultimately going to be two ways on this test that you may be asked to evaluate an argument. The first is to find new information to evaluate the validity, and you'll note that from the terms helpful and useful. The other is to evaluate the literal method of argument, and that's going to be identifiable from the terms point, proceeds, purpose, or anything indicating that you have to determine how the thing literally moves from part A to part B, meaning from the premise to the conclusion. Now, strategically, you need to carefully consider the question phrasing to properly identify the task. You don't want to be trying to evaluate validity if it wants you to evaluate the method of argument. You don't want to be evaluating the method of argument if it's asking you to evaluate the validity of the claim. You do have to specifically identify the conclusion or conclusions if there are multiple speakers in the prompt. And if you're seeking additional information, you may want to identify the type of argument if it's readily apparent to you to help predict the relevant evidence that could be used to evaluate the validity of that claim. If you're evaluating the method of argument, however, you want to carefully track your facts and opinions as either premise or conclusion. You have to be careful, though, of introducing variables that are not directly related to the conclusion in your evaluation for either version of an evaluate task. And you'll eliminate more quickly as soon as one of the choices closely match your prediction or closely match your notes of what the structure of the argument was if you're being asked to evaluate the method of the argument. So you should recognize our argumentation equation at this point, and you know that the premise or objective facts plus the assumption, the unstated facts that must be true, provide a link to the conclusion, which is your subjective opinion requiring support. So if you are being asked to evaluate the validity of an argument, you need to locate additional information to help evaluate whether the implicit assumptions linking the premises to the conclusion would be either likely or unlikely to be true. So the answer to the question posed by the choice that's correct will actually change the outcome of whether the conclusion is valid or not. And your arguments, of course, can be categorized in multiple ways, but by focusing closely on the specifics of the premises, you might be able to more specifically predict and broadly predict, specifically kind of do both simultaneously, categorically, we'll say, predict the type of evidence needed to evaluate that conclusion. Now, our common argument evaluations, if we're looking at an analogy-based argument, you want to consider whether the items are comparable in relevant ways, those in the evidence and in the conclusion. If you're looking at a representation-based argument, you want to consider whether the sample represents the larger whole, and are there any term shifts from the evidence or premise to the conclusion that are not viable. Our data and evidence interpretation arguments, you want to consider whether the data or evidence can reasonably interpret it in some other way. When we're talking about a causality, you will have to evaluate whether other possible causes or outcomes are possible or reasonable, or whether the circumstance seems to be coincidental once it's evaluated more closely. And for plan or recommendation based arguments, you want to consider in your evaluation whether the execution of the plan or recommendation is necessary, and will the approach that is being recommended reasonably work according to the defined set metric of success. So let's take a look at an example here. And as always, we go to the question stem first. Which of the following would it be most useful to establish in order to evaluate the argument above? So we recognize the key terms, most useful, indicating that we want to evaluate the argument, not evaluate how the argument proceeds or what its method is. So we recognize those key terms and we read the paragraph from the beginning. Many people believe that humans have an almost psychic intuition that allows them to know when they are being watched. This belief has been corroborated by a recent study in which 100 individuals were each seated alone in a room with a one-way window pane and asked whether they were being watched from behind the window pane. The subjects correctly determined whether they were being watched 80% of the time. So we note the evidence, and we've got a study here. And that study indicates a possible common argument of a representative sample. So we've got to identify the conclusion and make sure you don't just highlight this belief has been corroborated by a recent study or just that many people believe, because you need both pieces as our conclusion of many people believe that humans have an almost psychic intuition that allows them to know when they are being watched. This belief has been corroborated by a recent study. That is the full conclusion. Then we've got to broadly predict what the correct answer should do based on the reasoning. And in this case, it's to help determine whether the evidence from the study is representative or can be reasonably interpreted in some other way. So we're basically looking at a hybrid of evidence and representation. So we introduce our answer choices at this point, and we'll process eliminate for our common wrong argumentation reasons, including vague impacts. So how the subjects were chosen, I mean, I have no idea what that does, and that's going to require additional information. It's also making the argument or the outcome not seem more easily evaluatable, so that ultimately is kind of even a reversal that introduces additional issues to evaluate, as would choice A, how many of the subjects believe in psychics, okay? Like psychics the people? I mean, I've got a whole lot more questions than answers, and the main thing about an evaluate task is the correct answer should answer a question you have about the validity, not introduce new questions, such as choice C does with what time of day the experiment was conducted. Okay, like I need a whole lot more information to make this relevant at all, so we can eliminate choice C as requiring additional information. And whether the subjects were paid to participate, again, that doesn't tell me whether or not they are able to correctly determine whether they're being watched. So we then are left with choice B, whether the window pane was soundproof. And you have to be careful because you might say to yourself, well, who cares if it's soundproof? But I always have to consider what the implications of the information in the answer choice are. So in this case, if the window pane was soundproof, well, then they wouldn't be able to hear whether they were being watched from behind the pane. But if the window pane were not soundproof, then we might not believe that they were psychic. They may have just been hearing somebody loudly behind the window pane. So by considering both possible outcomes of the hypothetical that is presented in the answer choice, we can determine that B is the right answer, because whether the window pane was soundproof or not is actually helping to determine whether that study is representative, because if it's soundproof, it's kind of representative. If it's not, then the study was flawed, and I don't believe its results. So then moving back to our argumentation equation to talk about the other way you may be asked to evaluate an argument, and that's evaluating the method of the argument. So when you are being asked to evaluate the method of an argument, you'll simply diagram your argument or arguments, premises, and conclusion or conclusions on the scratchpad. And you'll predict broadly by simply noting facts and opinions as they're presented in the argument or arguments, because you may have multiple speakers for these types of questions, as well as how they lead to the main conclusion of that argument. So we've got an example with two speakers this time. And we've got the task, the politician responds to the philosopher by. So we recognize the term respond, so that's asking what is the method by which the politician addresses the philosopher's argument. Longer form that way than just response, but that's ultimately what it's asking. So we read the statements from the top, and we're going to diagram the arguments as they're presented. So at the beginning, we have the philosopher who states the best leaders shape public opinion while challenging society's basest emotions and instincts. So there's not really an argument here, but there is a conclusion, and that's a subjective opinion. We don't necessarily believe the position of the philosopher, but the philosopher provides no premises either. So we just write something like PH as shorthand for philosopher, C, best leaders shape opinion and challenge society. That's the conclusion of the philosopher with no surrounding context, which clearly has to come from the politician in some fashion. So we move on to the politician, who states, while that may have been true in ancient times, the realities of modern democracy make it impossible to get elected on such a platform. So the best leaders shaped opinion in ancient times, but now they cannot. And then we've got effective modern elected officials must instead mold their principles into moderated policies that the public is willing to adopt. So our conclusion is that recommendation from the politician that effective modern officials must mold their principles to public opinion. So we've got a broad structure of the two arguments presented from the philosopher indicated by PH and from the politician indicated by PO. So we introduce our answer choices as we always would. And we'll begin our process of elimination, starting with vague impacts. And we've got choice B, more evolved, illustrating that modern society is more evolved than ancient society was. What does more evolved even mean? I have no idea. That couldn't be more vague if it tried. And then we've got to look for task reversals that incorrectly articulate what the method of argument is that's provided. So, starting with choice A, demanding evidence in support of her, meaning the philosopher's claim. Well, it doesn't say that we need evidence for the philosopher, even though the philosopher probably should have evidence. That is not the way in which the politician is responding. So we can eliminate choice A for basically just articulating the incorrect method of argument. Then we've got using an analogy to prove the point moot. Well, the politician does not use an analogy. So D is out as just not the method of the argument. And then lamenting that ancient times were better. That is not true. The politician does say that it's harder to get elected now, but not that ancient times broadly were better across the board. And choice C, accepting certain tenets of her argument. Well, the politician does agree with the philosopher that something may have been true in ancient times. But qualifying it for contemporary circumstances, well, it says that you can't do that anymore. And qualifying here just means adding a qualification, not like qualifying for a race. So it's just adding some condition that must be met in the contemporary or modern times. So choice C, in that bland verbal reasoning GMAT style, is properly articulating what the argument is literally doing and how the politician responds to the philosopher. So, step one of our evaluate an argument task process. First, note the evaluate task by recognizing the key indicator terms, and then you have to determine the specific type of evaluation that's being required. You'll then read the prompt as written to either hopefully determine a common type of argument, and you'll want to, of course, note the premise and conclusion in an argument diagram if you're looking at and evaluate the method of argument. In either case, you have to pay close attention to the conclusion. Step three, if a common argument is identified and you're being asked to evaluate additional information, you'll more specifically predict what that relevant useful evidence might be. If no common argument is identified, you could just use the generic prediction of find info to help determine if it's reasonable to conclude that whatever the conclusion was. But these prediction steps are only going to be if you're being asked for an evaluation of additional information to determine the validity of the conclusion, not to evaluate the manner in which an argument proceeds. And of course, step four, you're going to eliminate your choices against your additional information prediction or your argument diagram using our common wrong argument answer choices. You saw that it's kind of slimmed down what the wrong answer choices are here, but they're still from our argument side, not our inference side. So let's head on over to the whiteboard and take a look at a couple more examples to see how you'll be asked to evaluate arguments on the verbal reasoning section of the GMAT Focus Edition. Here we have a sample critical reasoning prompt and question. We'll set up our scratch work A through E as we always do, and we see the passage above proceeds by. So we're literally being asked to just replicate what the method of argument is here. So I'll just write proceeds, but I know that I'm going to need my premise and I'm going to need a conclusion. So we'll read from the top. Governments often respond to public criticism of necessary social services by introducing additional regulations overseeing those services. Okay, so we know that government often answer pub for public, crit for criticism of needed SS with added regs for regulation. Okay. And those regulations can lead to higher costs for consumers. Okay. And regs can increase the cost of those needed social services. Then we've got the public in the state of prime is actively criticizing government-funded early child care services. So I need a little bit more room. We're going to just shift our C down a bit. We know that the prime public are criticizing government ECS. But in this case, families should not necessarily expect to incur greater costs as a result. So the conclusion is that families should not expect an increase in the cost of the early child care services. So we've got our prediction, and it's just the diagram. And yes, it does take a little bit of time to write this out. You're going to refer to your premise and your conclusion that you've written out as opposed to going back into the paragraph. But hopefully, by doing this effort to start, you will only have to go through the choices on a single pass. So choice A, presenting a broadly accepted circumstance that its conclusion questions as a rule. Well, it doesn't question it as a rule, it questions it in this specific circumstance, so that's kind of a reversal of the way the argument actually proceeds. Considering alternative approaches, we don't have alternative approaches, so that's just plainly wrong. Theorizing about the cause of an outcome before questioning that explanation. It doesn't theorize about the cause, so that too would be a task reversal. Positing a set of facts and presenting an exception to them. This is perfectly good and bland. And arguing that a generally held principle needs an overall reevaluation. Again, it's not saying that the whole thing needs to be reevaluated, just in this specific circumstance. So you can see it takes a while at the outset to make sure you're understanding what's happening, but by doing that effort, you're able to go through the answer choices hopefully pretty quickly. And in this case, the correct one is D. So then we'll scroll on down and take a look at one more example of our other type of evaluate task, which is asking to evaluate whether the conclusion seems viable. So we'll set up our scratch work again, A, B, C, D, E, put a little line over top. We're being asked which of the following would be most useful to investigate for the purpose of determining if trust in judges will allow the public to have faith in the punishments given for crimes. Okay, so we'll just say useful as the task. And my PE for predicted evaluate, again, I've got the task and the subject in the question stem. So my predicted explanation is just find info to help determine if trust in judges equals public faith in crime punishments. And of course, we have to read the paragraph in full to understand what's happening, but I can pretty much get my prediction even before I go to that paragraph. So, from the beginning, determining an appropriate punishment for various crimes requires evaluating the intent of an individual who commits an illegal act. However, evidence of intent is much more difficult to obtain than is evidence of an act itself. Therefore, trust in judges is necessary for the public to have faith that reasonable punishments will be meted out in the courtroom. So it's all about the trust in judges. And we basically need to make sure that that is in some way going to help dictate public faith. So, choice A, whether judges are generally capable of evaluating the character of defendants. I don't love it, but at choice A, I might give it the squiggle. I'm like, yeah, we're talking about judges. At least they're being, in some way relevant to this. Now, whether the public believes that judges are capable arbiters of criminal intent. Now, if you understand what arbiters means, this should be a check because it's saying that the judges who they put the faith in are able to determine whether criminal intent was there or not. And that would work perfectly with our prediction. But if you don't know what arbiters means, this has to get a question mark. Now, choice C, whether individual judges may levy different punishments in similar cases. Well, there's a bunch of vague terms, and we can eliminate choice C for that reason. Then choice D, whether evidence of intent can be discovered in the course of an investigation. Well, we already said that it's hard to find. Does figuring out if it's possible to find really help? Not really. So this would be a task reversal because you're like, well, we already said it's not helpful or not easy to find that evidence of intent. So that's why we got to go to the judges and put trust in the judges for public faith in crime punishment. So D's just kind of irrelevant broadly. And then choice E, whether juries are involved in determining punishment guidelines. Well, this needs a whole bunch of additional information. Like, do they rely on the judges? Like, how would the juries interact with the judges? Whether the juries are capable of determining whether intent is there or not. Whole bunch of reasons to eliminate choice E. But then we'd go back to choices A and B. And remember, by default, if we have the question mark and a squiggle as our only two markings, we're going to pick the question mark by default. But when we're down to two, we also want to seek specific actions and descriptions as definitive reasons to eliminate. And the terms generally capable and the character of defendants are just too vague as well. Whereas choice B is speaking specifically about criminal intent and what the public believes. And remember that specificity is preferable to ambiguity for critical reasoning argument tasks and the correct answer choices. So go ahead and practice some drill sets of the types of evaluation you might be asked to complete to get better at what are some of the more obscure and harder question tasks that you'll encounter in the entire verbal reasoning section of the GMAT Focus Edition.